Alright, so most of you guys know me as the guy who drove 1,000 miles off-road through the UK, and I'm well aware that most of you found me through that series. But that trip was just the latest in a long line of expeditions and journeys that I've done overland in the Land Cruiser. So I wanted to use today's video to kind of fill you in on a bit of my history, my backstory, how I found myself doing these expeditions, and tell you a few stories in the hopes of giving you some idea of exactly who I am and what my history's been in this space. So I'm coming to you here from my tiny little terrace on my tiny little apartment here in Mexico City. I actually live in Mexico for kind of half the year and have done for the last few years, 3 or 4 years, while I've been working a remote corporate job. Mexico is a destination that I passed through on my first expedition in the Land Cruiser, which is the Pan American Highway. I drove from the US all the way down to the south of Argentina, Ushuaia. That was back in 2016 I started that expedition, and Mexico was the first Latin American country that I passed through. And immediately after crossing the border, I remember thinking, wow, this is like something else that I've never experienced in my life. You know, I felt an instant affinity with the country, with the culture, with the people. The architecture is incredible, the food, everything I just loved. And so after I finished the expedition, 2.5 years later down in the south of Argentina, I always knew I wanted to live in Mexico. And so by working this job and by kind of working to build myself up in various different ways, living in Mexico has kind of realized that dream for me, which has been fantastic. My tenure with the corporate world is coming to somewhat of an end, and I'll actually be leaving Mexico City pretty soon. I've kind of split my time between the UK, Europe, Mexico over the last few years. I've got in some really cool expeditions in the Land Cruiser, but I've also spent a lot of time here, and I've built up a life here and a friend group, and I really feel at home here. And things are about to change because I'm going to go away in the car on another huge expedition. That's a story for another day. I'll be announcing that soon. But things are about to change for me for the first time in a long time. And so I'm kind of like running down the clock here the last few weeks in Mexico City. On one hand, I'm really excited for what's to come. The expedition that I'm planning is going to be epic. It's going to be an extended trip in the Land Cruiser for the first time in a long time. But I'm also melancholy because I'm going to be leaving a life here that I've worked really hard to build and that I really, really enjoy. And so it's kind of feels strange not knowing what the future holds, honestly. So yeah, anyway, all that to say, here's a basic rundown of my history with overlanding. This all started for me when my cousin Ross brought back a built Land Rover Defender 110. We must have been 21 years old, I think, and he came back with this thing, and he decided that this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to travel the world in a Land Rover, and he brought this thing back, and I was blown away by it. It was like lifted suspension, massive tires on it, winch on the front, built out inside, very basic setup for kind of sleeping. And he was like, right, I'm gonna go drive across Europe and go down to Morocco. I was like, oh my god, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And so from that moment, I kind of helped him do a few odd jobs on it, and he set off. He went down into Morocco and went through Europe. That concept of traveling in a vehicle was totally new to me. I'd backpacked a lot in the past, but I never even considered the possibility or the idea of traveling by vehicle. It was a whole new concept to me. This is in the days that before overlanding was really a thing, you know? It was a keyword known to a very small subset of people, like hardcore border crossing overlanders. This is back in like 2012, maybe 2010 even. And so it wasn't a commonly known thing. So Ross went and did his thing. This kind of seed was planted into my mind from that moment on. And so we kind of started discussing the idea of doing a trip together. By this point, he'd sold the Land Rover and bought a VW Synchro. I went out to visit him in Poland, and we traveled through Poland for a while, and I was just so sold on the lifestyle. And so we started planning, what could we do? We both had girlfriends at the time, and we were all sitting around one rainy winter evening, and we were like, what kind of big trip could we do? You know, we want to do something big in vehicles. And we're watching the Top Gear Africa special. Somebody suggested, why don't we drive the length of Africa? And immediately I was like, absolutely. At the time I had an Audi A3, I had like a corporate job. And I was like, could I take the A3, you know? I was like, maybe? That is, you know, to say how little I knew about the world of overlanding and 4x4 travel expeditions and such like. So we ended up planning this whole trip to drive Pan-Africa. London to Cape Town was going to be the route. We had everything planned out in pretty rigorous detail, honestly. We had all the border crossings mapped out, the route mapped out. Ross and I went halfers on another Land Rover 110 with the intention to either do it up to sell or for me to do the trip in and buy his half out. And so we ended up working on that for the summer of, I think it was 2014. So we ended up working on these vehicles. He had the Synchro, I had this Land Rover 110. It turned out to be an absolute shitbox, and we sold it, long story short. In the meantime, the west of Africa, the route that we were going to go through, also turned to shit. There was a few different things happened simultaneously, one of which was Ebola, the disease, which closed a bunch of West African countries' borders. You just couldn't go through because they were trying to contain the disease. And the other thing was Boko Haram, the militant group, which was kidnapping people in Nigeria at the time, and that was a big deal at the time. You know, they were kind of fighting against the military. And so between these two things, we realized Africa was not going to be possible. And so there was a moment there where we were like, maybe this is just insane. Maybe we're trying to do too much, and what we're trying to do is impossible. We all sat down in a pub beer garden one night in late September in 2014, and we kind of discussed the idea of calling it all off. Should we just, you know, ditch the idea, or should we think of another big trip that we could do? And Ross came up with the idea of the Pan American Highway. Can we do the Pan American Highway? Driving from the US to Argentina, Alaska to Argentina originally was the plan. And that to me was like, oh my God, that's a whole other concept. I need to wrap my brain around the idea of getting like, I still didn't even have a 4x4 at this point of any vehicle. And so the idea of shipping a vehicle, it all just seemed like a distant pipe dream, you know? We went away, this seed germinated in my mind, and I started to look at what it actually would entail. And I soon became sold on the idea of the Pan American Highway. All this time I was scanning European car websites to see if anything came up, and Ross at this point had sold his Synchro, so he was without a vehicle as well. And the whole thing had the air of like, is it going to happen, is it not going to happen? And these two vehicles came up, one HZJ73 Land Cruiser in the north of Holland, and one HZJ78 Land Cruiser in the south of Belgium. And we were like, wow, these look like pretty good vehicles. I started to look into the idea of a Land Cruiser rather than a Land Rover. At that point, I was like looking at Defenders pretty much exclusively. Long story short, we flew out to Europe, went to Holland. I saw this vehicle, bought it. We drove down to Belgium, saw the 78, bought that. He came back and picked that up at another time, and we drove them back to the UK and started to build them out. Fast forward 6 months, we'd built these cruisers up in incredibly rudimentary setup, and I was still so naive and so green. Like, I couldn't even change a wheel bearing, you know? Like, if you put a gun to my head, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I'd put like a cage on the Land Cruiser and thrown a roof tent on the top of it, a cheap no-name roof tent, and called it good pretty much. And we shipped these vehicles from Antwerp to Baltimore in the east of the United States. And so we arrived a month later, following the boat, got in these vehicles and basically drove the entire length of the Pan American Highway over the course of 2.5 years. It was a transformative trip for me, and I learned on the way, you know, that there was disasters that you wouldn't believe. Transmissions blowing up multiple times, bearings exploding on the side of highways, chronic rear axle issue with mine, which resulted in me having to pull the diff out in the middle of nowhere in South America. And driving that trail was just so transformative to everything. Every part of me transformed, you know. The way that I saw the world, my value system. Up until that point, I'd led a really sheltered life, honestly. And I was so naive to the ways of the world, and then just being thrown into that insane scenario in which it's like, yeah, it's you against the world. This vehicle, and you're driving through hostile territory. You know, some of the terrain that you drive through is incredibly remote and incredibly dangerous. Deserts for thousands of kilometers, high altiplano, freezing cold, 5,000 meters above sea level, altitude sickness. You know, like it was an intense trip, and the self-reliance that instills in you is something that will change you in the most fundamental of ways. So we shipped these vehicles back from Argentina 2.5 years later, arrived back into the UK. I took on a corporate job, and we all went about our lives and trying to adjust to normal, safe, easy, predictable life out of being able to survive in some of the world's most hostile places. And you pride yourself on the skill set that you've built there, which is then suddenly useless, is the most strange feeling I've ever experienced in my life. And the transition was earth-shattering, honestly. You know, trying to find my place in society and in civilization after that experience, where people value money, cars, status, and I had this whole experience that they couldn't possibly comprehend, you know. It was a very strange feeling of loneliness. And so we started to plan another expedition, but we arrived back with a bunch of debt. The Land Cruiser was in terrible shape, and I was faced with this decision to make. Should I consider a different vehicle? Should I bother renovating this vehicle, but by which point was rusty underneath? It was at the end of its life cycle, honestly. There was all kinds of mechanical problems with it, and I'd seen overlanders with campers all the way down the Pan American Highway, and I always envied them so much. You know, we were living out of a roof tent with like a super basic setup inside, cooking off the back door in all weather, snowstorms, blizzards, rain, whatever. You were cooking there and living outside. And every time we'd pull into like a campsite where there would be campers with an enclosed camping area, they would shut the door and you'd hear the TV on or whatever in there, and you're sitting out there freezing. I always thought, God almighty, I want a camper, you know. And so I started down the idea of building a camper, you know, and I looked at my tiny little 73, which is shorter than the standard 78, 75s or 78s that you would usually build a camper on, thinking like, can I do this? My prerequisites were for building a camper, I don't want to compromise on off-road ability. The 73 is incredibly good off-road, better either than a 75 or a 78. And so this idea hashed in my mind. I was like, I'm going to build the world's tiniest and most awesome camper while still maintaining all of my off-road ability, because I don't want to compromise on that, you know. That's the part of all this that gives me real value, you know, the insane 4x4 stuff. So down this rabbit hole I went. And very long story short, again, I will elaborate on all this in other videos. I took it to a friend's house who lived around 40 minutes drive away, who had some basic mechanical knowledge. We chopped the Land Cruiser in a moment of madness as British winter was approaching, which is just brutal, by the way. He didn't have an inside space to work on it, and we were working on it outside. So we chopped it, realized that we were in way over our heads, and the whole project ground to a halt. By this point, I was working on a house project as well with my girlfriend at the time, so that was taking up all my time. So I was, again, stuck between these two worlds of like building a house here in my hometown. Are we going to live in this house? Are we not? Are we going to build the Land Cruiser and go away on another expedition? Like, what the hell's going to happen here, you know? And the Land Cruiser project was the one to suffer, and so throughout the whole winter, this chopped thing, exposed to the elements, was just sitting rusting in my friend's driveway. It reached a point where he kind of called me up one day and he said, like, this needs to go because I'm getting complaints from the neighbors. We're obviously not making any progress on it. Like, it needs to leave, you know, and I had nowhere to take it. And so in the end, I managed to secure some space in a local hangar, basically, that was under construction. And managed to truck the shell of a vehicle into this hangar. I remember it alighting and me thinking like, Christ, I don't think this is salvageable, honestly. There was a point where I honestly thought it was done for, you know. I didn't have the know-how to even contemplate building this thing on my own, you know. I just didn't know how to do it. I'd watched the videos, I'd kind of conferred with friends and stuff, and we had a vague plan, but I just didn't have the technical skills to do it. One of my very good friends, Ben, he offered to help me build this camper. He's a carpenter but has some experience with metalwork, and so we set about building this thing in the hangar. Without him, it would have been a foregone conclusion that this Land Cruiser would have gone to scrap. And so I'm incredibly, eternally grateful to him for helping me with it. And so together we built this thing. We put the shell together, and then he went off and did his own thing, traveling. And so I was left with basically the shell of the camper, all the basics done, but I still needed to figure out the roof system, how it was going to pop up, the actual canvas sides, the inside, all the systems inside and all that kind of thing. And so I was working away on this project on my own, making no progress, just day after day after day, brutal through British winter, freezing cold every night in this hangar, and working in the days, you know, pulling 16, 18-hour days every single day. Meanwhile, the house build was suffering because of it, because I knew I had a limited time on this Land Cruiser in the space that I was in. The relationship suffered also, and my girlfriend and I ended up splitting up. And so then I moved back in with my parents, and I remember thinking at that point, this is bad, you know, like I'm single at 30 basically. I'm back living with my parents. The only thing that I really have to my name is this like knackered vehicle that isn't really built and needs a whole lot more work to be able to be something, you know. And it was honestly a low point in my life, you know. And so I kept on working away. Long story short, I ended up having to leave the hangar that I was in. The vehicle became persona non grata again. I ended up taking it out to a friend of mine's truck garage on the outskirts of town, where we made limited progress on it. And the catalyst really came for me finishing this massive project was when COVID came, and I ended up moving in with my cousin Roz and his family during COVID, and I managed to get the cruiser from the yard that it was in and brought it to their house just as lockdown was happening. And as lockdown happened, we were stuck in the house, we couldn't do anything, and I had all this time on my hands, and I was able to dedicate all this time into building this cruiser up. And so over the course of that time there, and then getting it watertight, getting the basics of the inside in, I then moved into my own house and finished the cruiser off finally. So fast forward another 8-9 months. This is 3 years in now since I came back from the trip. I was working away on the cruiser outside in the street, living in my own house and working this remote job, and there came a point where I needed to go to the US for work. I just finished the cruiser and I had to leave it for a few months. As I flew over just into the teeth of Omicron, the COVID variety, I met a girl on the plane. She was Spanish and she was flying back to Madrid. I was connecting in Madrid. We hit it off and kept in contact. I went away to the US for 3-4 months. Came back and we made plans to meet in France. I was going to drive the cruiser out, and I had this idea that I was going to finally go down to Morocco and do all the amazing stuff down there. And so I got back from my trip, packed up the car and headed out to Europe. And this is just as Omicron was starting. The whole of Europe was shutting down and I was just driving out into it. And so we met in France and drove all the way through France and Spain. It's difficult to describe what the feeling was like in Europe at that point, but it was a climate of fear. There was a whole new variant of COVID. Nobody knew how potent it was, but they knew it was ripping through the population. And so foreigners were viewed with suspicion and were to be kept at arm's length. Meanwhile, Morocco closed its land border, or its ferry crossing, with Spain, and so that went out the window for me. And so immediately I was just kind of stranded in Europe without anywhere to go. And so I actually ended up living with this girl that I met on the plane at a place in northern Spain. Just spur in the moment, living in the moment. And we did a lot of trips, around Spain in the cruiser, but ultimately I was living with her. Eventually, I grew restless, and I wanted to go and do something big, you know. Morocco was off the cards for me. It was closed for, I think, ultimately a year. Morocco closed down for. And so I started looking more domestically as to what I could do, as in inside of Europe. And so this idea occurred to me: could I cross a European country without using paved roads? And so I fell into a rabbit hole of trying to find ways in which I could possibly do this, looking up tracks, 4x4 routes, GPX maps, all that kind of thing. And I ended up piecing together a route that was going to take me from the very north of Portugal to the very south without using paved roads. So I kind of had this map loosely cobbled together. I was still working full-time at the remote job, and I set off into one Saturday morning in the dead of winter in Spain, and went and drove the entirety of Portugal without using paved roads. And it was an eye-opening expedition. It was the first big thing that I'd done since the Pan-American Highway. It was the first big test of a Land Cruiser build that I'd built, you know. It was my first time really properly off-roading in the new build since I built it, since I started the build all of those years ago, which by this point is like 4 years. And getting back out there on the trail was like a rebirth to me. I felt like I was whole again. You know, I was using this skill set that had been long neglected, that I kind of based my value system on. And I was out there on my own this time, relying on just me and my skills to drive this insane trail. It was 1,500 kilometers more or less, so like 1,200 miles of totally off-road terrain, and it was incredible, an absolutely life-changing trip, and it left me wanting more. And so I came back to the UK the next year. I got into a whole lot of other things with buying property, which again is another story. I bought some rental properties in an effort to kind of support this lifestyle. Got into renovating those, and that took me a couple of years. Next thing, I decided to look very domestically for my next expedition, and in the middle of one of my house renovations, I had some time off, and I started to think about what I could do domestically with the Land Cruiser. And at that point, the idea for 1,000 miles off-road was born. And that brings us pretty much up to date with my overlanding history. This is a very glossed over version of everything that happened, and if you want to know more, like, let me know in the comments down below. You know, any of these specific things you want to know about, like the build, the Pan-American Highway, specific countries on the Pan Am, Portugal, Spain, like anything you want to know, just let me know down there, and you know, if I get enough requests, I'll do a video on it. But thanks for listening. Hopefully you know a little bit more about who I am, what I do, why I do what I do, where I'm coming from, and hopefully we'll connect a little bit more on these videos because of it. Appreciate you being here. Peace.